So what I wanted to do this morning is just to go back to some basics really and remind us about why we do what we do in our ministry amongst older people. And what I'm hoping is that this morning you'll just come away really encouraged and also be able to articulate in a new way God's heart for the older generations. Having looked at the participants, I'm aware that this morning I'm preaching to the converted, and there's some giants in older people's ministry amongst us. So, you know, I don't claim to know everything this morning at all, but I hope by going back to some basics that you, as I say, you will be encouraged. And what I want to do is just cheer you on this morning in the work that you're doing, because I really believe that ministry amongst older people is close to God's heart. So I thought I'd share a little bit about me very briefly and a little bit about Embracing Age, and then we'll talk about what we're talking about this morning. So from as far back as I can remember, I have loved older people. And I think one of my earliest memories is going to visit Mrs. Smith with my mum as a child and having homemade lemonade and cake. And I wonder if some of the seeds were sown at that point in my life as a young child. I started my career as a nurse and I worked with older people. And then after I had kids, it was like time to go back to work. And I was like, do I go back to nursing or do I do something different? And so I decided to go into the charity sector, and I worked for some secular organisations that work with older people. And then I set up Embracing Age in 2014 because I really wanted to do something that was from a Christian base and working with perhaps people who are a bit more forgotten and on the margins. So Embracing Age, our vision, if you like, is a world where older people are valued, connected and full of hope. And I'm sure that resonates with many of you. And the way we do that is by equipping churches. So webinars like this, we mobilise volunteers, we combat loneliness, and we speak out when we get the opportunity. We have two main projects. One is called Carers Connected, and it's a weekly Zoom meeting for informal carers, and it just gives them the opportunity to chat and pray together. And that has been such a lovely group to be a part of. They blessed me as much as it is a blessing to them as well. And then our other project is Care Home Friends, where we mobilise volunteers to go into care homes and befriend care home residents, obviously being quite challenging over the pandemic, as you can imagine. But enough about me and Embracing Age. What I want us to think about this morning is, why does the church need to think strategically about its ministry amongst older people? And then I want to take a fresh look at the people that we're serving. What do we mean when we say older people, and why are they so valuable in the sight of God? So why do we need to think strategically about ministry amongst older people? Well, I think there's three main reasons that we need to do that. And the first is that we're living in an ageing population, and it's not something that's just in the UK. It's a worldwide thing that's happening, that our population is ageing. Now, to give you some stats around that, the number of centenarians, that's people over 100, increased by 85% between 2012 and 2017. I mean, that is huge. By 2030, it's predicted that 1 in 5 people will be over 65, that's 20% of our population, and the over 85 age group is forecast to double in the next 20 years. Now, these are really significant figures, and you know, we need to be realizing that this is the environment that we're living in. And not only that, but not only is the population aging, but our congregations are aging as well. And part of that is because we're living within an aging population, but also our congregations are aging much faster than the population around us. So again, some stats for you. In 2000, 25% of congregations were over age 65, and that's forecast to rise to 45% by 2030. And in 2005, 5% of the over 65s within the congregations were 85 plus, and that's forecast to rise back to 19% by 2030. So our populations are aging. Now, our congregations are aging, our population is aging. Now, you could see that negatively, but actually one of the main reasons that we have an aging population is that we're all living longer. It's actually a really positive thing. You know, we're also having less children, but on the positive side, you know, developments in healthcare is enabling us to all live longer. So it's not a negative thing, but it is something we need to be preparing for and thinking strategically about. Final reason I think it's really important that we think strategically about ministry amongst older people is that the church should be a good place to grow old. There's this verse in Zechariah that someone pointed out to me a couple of years ago, and I was like, yes, this is amazing. So it's from the Message, it's the Message version, but it puts it in a really good way. Old men and old women will come back to Jerusalem, sit on benches on the streets and spin tales, move safely around with their canes, a good city to grow old in. And boys and girls will fill the public parks, laughing and playing, a good city to grow up in. Now, often in the Bible, Jerusalem is seen to represent the church. And for me, what this is saying, or one way it can be interpreted, is that the church should not only be a good place to grow up in, it should be a good place to grow old in as well. And I think sometimes, perhaps in the past, and I'm sure I'm speaking to the converted in some ways, but within the church at large, there's been a kind of emphasis on the church being a good place to grow up in. And yes, we do want the church to be a good place to grow up in. I'm not knocking youth ministry at all, because I've got 3 children in their early 20s or just under as well. So, you know, yes, we want the church to be a good place to grow up in, but we also need it to be a good place to grow old in. And in fact, you know, we're not going to stem the tide of an aging population and an aging congregation just by bringing more young people back into the church, because it's the society we're living in. The population is aging, and I think actually it lacks authenticity if we're sort of bringing all these young people into the church, but then not reaching out in love to the older generations as well. You know, young people, I mean, I've got 3 myself, they can you know, see lack of authenticity a mile away, you know, and they notice it, you know. So we need to be authentic. If we're trying to bring young people in, we also need to love our older people as well. Again, I know I'm speaking to the converted, but I hope that helps you in the way you communicate around the importance of our older people's ministry. So one thing we need to think about then is, what do we mean by old? You know, when we're talking about older people, how old is old? It's an interesting question, and it probably depends on how old you are. I remember seeing this no, it wasn't a kids program, it was a program on Channel 4 about getting kids into care homes, and they asked this 4-year-old, how old is really old? I don't know how you would answer that question. The 4-year-old thought 30 was really old. So most of us are, you know, really over the hill compared to her definition of really old. I think the best definition I've heard from a member of our congregation who's retired is 10 years older than me. And I think that's for most of us. You know, it's people who are older than us who are really old. It can be helpful to think of the 3rd and the 4th age of life. I'm just going to cough, hang on. Sorry about that. Where the 3rd age is about the actively retired people, and then the 4th age is when people move into a more frail season of life where they become more dependent and perhaps have cognitive problems, physical problems, that means they can't be as independent as they would like to be. Now, as a nurse, when I was nursing years ago, I worked in a day hospital, and people would come in and have their treatments and go home. And I had a 96-year-old lady who came in, and the only reason she needed treatment was because her legs had swollen and she couldn't ride her horse in Hyde Park anymore. And so we sorted her legs out, and she got back. She could put her that's because she couldn't put her riding boots on, that was the issue. And she got her riding boots back on, and off she went. And you know, someone like her, she's 96, but she is in the 3rd age of life still. Now, on the other hand, I've looked after people who are much younger than her, who are housebound and a lot frailer. So obviously these categorizations have their limitations, and they're very fluid as well, because someone could move into the fourth age of life during a period of ill health and then come out of it again. But it's a good way of taking numbers out of age and thinking of it in a different way. I think one of the dangers in terms of older people is that we put them into one big lump. We lump them all together when actually there's quite a few different generations represented. And I've got this picture. This is my oldest daughter, and she's holding a friend's baby. I think she was 20 in that photo, and the baby was 2 months. Now, you wouldn't think of putting those two into the same generation grouping, and yet we readily put a 68-year-old in the same sort of generation group as an 88-year-old. It's important that we recognize that there's different generations when we're talking about older people. And I had an interesting chat with my mum and dad when I was writing my book. I said, okay, mum and dad, how would you describe yourselves? Do you see yourselves as seniors? And they were like, certainly not, we're not seniors. They're in their mid-70s, by the way. And I said, okay, so how would you describe yourselves? And so my mum said, well, I would say that I'm young at heart. I said, okay. And my dad said, I wouldn't put a label on myself at all. He said, I'd just say I was in my 70s. I said, okay. I said, well, what about the label actively retired? Would you be happy with that? And they said, well, if we have to have a label, then yeah, that one's okay. And but my dad said, but I'd rather be inactive than retired, but mum won't let me. So it's important that we think about this labeling and how we categorize older people, because it's going to impact our ministry amongst older people. And how we view older people, how we label them, how we talk about them will shape what we do in our ministry. And it's foundational to anything that we build. So what I want us to think about for a minute, that's another thing I was going to say, that in the people in the fourth age of life, there's a temptation, perhaps in the world more, that we view them as of less value, because they can't contribute so much anymore. I think sometimes these temptations creep into the church as well, but that's another story. But you see, on the opposite hand, what can happen is that we might not think that we do that, but what we can do is end up valuing people for being able to fill up slots on our rotas, and so people in the third age of life, it's like, yes, they can do this and do that, and we value them for what they can do. And actually, valuing people for what they can do is as bad as not valuing people for what they can't do, in a way, because our value isn't based on what we do and what we can't do, what we contribute and what we can't contribute. And both can actually be dangerous. I don't know if you've ever been in situations where people just want you for what you can do. It's just exhausting, to be honest. So if our value isn't based on what we do, what is it based on? And that's what I want us to think about a little bit this morning. And I think it comes down to some fundamental biblical truths that we're going to look at. So how do we view older people? We're going to look at 4 things. And I would want to credit John Swinton for this, because I read his book on dementia, and it's just shaped what I'm sharing this morning. So the Bible tells us that we're dependent, that we're created in the image of God, that we're loved, and that we're relational. I'm going to go through each of those ones a little bit individually. So first of all, we're dependent. Now, this is really controversial, actually. When you speak to people about this, we hate being dependent. When my daughter had an accident a few weeks ago, I had to be dependent on people. I had to go up to Nottingham to be with her, stay with people I didn't know. And I was so out of my comfort zone. I just did not like this dependence. And most of us don't like being dependent. But actually, it's God's heart for us that we're dependent on one another. Galatians says, carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. And when you think about it, the God of the universe, his plan to save us involved coming down to earth as a baby. You can't get much more dependent than a baby. The creator becomes dependent on the created. Now, if dependence is good enough for the God of the universe, it's good enough for us. There's a brilliant quote by John Stott that I haven't got time to share with you this morning, but it's in the book. And another thing, when you think about it, when Jesus sent out his disciples, he said, go, don't take anything with you, etc., etc. And I'd always thought, oh yeah, because they've got to be dependent on God, and you know, that's good. But then when I thought about it, I thought, no, actually, I mean, yes, they've got to be dependent on God, but what Jesus is doing is making them dependent on other people, because he's saying, when you go into a house, stay there, you know. So actually, again, Jesus is modeling this dependence on one another. We're designed for dependence, whether we like it or not. That's how we're designed. So dependence, created in the image of God. You know, at the beginning of time, God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. And then in Genesis, it also says that we've got the breath of God. He breathed his life into us. The Lord formed the man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. You know, just think about that for a minute. We're created in the image of God, that we've got God's breath breathed into us, if that's a quite complicated sentence to say. And I think that's why Jesus could say, whatever you did for the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me, because we've got his breath in us. And actually our whole identity flows from this, because we're created in the image of God. We've been adopted. We are sons and daughters of the King of Kings. And you've probably heard the saying where it says, I think, therefore I am. But actually, is that true? Because what happens when you can't think anymore? What happens when your cognition is impaired, or your physical ability is impaired, but particularly cognition? Are you then somehow less of a person because you can't think anymore? Obviously no, because that's not what our value, that's not what our identity is based on. Our identity is based on the fact that we're created in the image of God, that we're sons and daughters of the King of Kings, and that's never going to change. Whatever happens to us, whatever phase of life we're in, people in the fourth age of life, someone with advanced dementia, is still created in the image of God. They still have the breath of God in them. And that leads me to my next point, which is this: we're loved. We are so loved. And actually, if you take nothing else from this seminar this morning, what I really want you to take away with you is this sense of you are loved more than you could ever imagine. Because if we are going to love others with God's unconditional love, then we need to have experienced it ourselves. We need it to overflow from the love that God has put in us. And I know this is really basic stuff, really basic. But the point is, when you've been a Christian a long time, sometimes you need reminding of these basic things, because after a while, if we're not careful, we kind of know we're loved. It's in our head. Yes, God loves me, but it can sometimes then sort of creep into becoming about performance. You know, have I read my Bible enough? Have I prayed enough? Have I served enough? Or whatever it is that makes you feel like you've sort of ticked the right boxes for God. But actually, it's not dependent on that. And the flip side of that is, you know, if we feel like we've done all those things, we can end up feeling a bit pharisaical and proud when we compare ourselves to others. But the bottom line is that it never is, and it never was, about our performance. You know, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. You know, whatever you do for God in your ministry amongst older people is not going to make him love you more, because he loves you as much as he can already. You know, he's already full of love for you. I love the verse in Romans where it says nothing can separate us from God's love, neither life nor death, angels nor demons, etc., etc. And I think something we could slip in there is neither frailty nor dementia. There's nothing that can separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord. So we're dependent, created in the image of God, loved and relational. You know, at the beginning of time, God said it's not good for man to be alone. Now, we know loneliness is an issue, and I think the pandemic has highlighted that in such a stark way. You know, that the whole, I'm speaking to so many people at the moment who have got mental health problems coming out of the pandemic. You know, we're not designed to be locked down and alone. You know, we're designed for a relationship. We're designed for a relationship with God, and we're designed for a relationship with one another. People, I think, in the fourth age of life, I think people are particularly at more risk of loneliness because of they have the potential to experience so much loss in their life, loss of health, loss of loved ones, loss of capacity, even things like hearing loss. You know, makes it so difficult even to chat to people on the phone. So, you know, it's really important that you know, this idea of relationship. And that's what we're designed for. And even, you know, someone in the fourth age of life who's in a care home is created in the image of God. They're loved and they need relationship. You know, I think so often in care homes, you know, people, especially in those late stages of dementia, can be very much left. They have all their physical needs met, but not always. But that's a whole nother story. We won't go into that this morning, but we still need relationship, whatever phase of life we're in. We need that connections with one another. And, you know, as we love unconditionally, as we love older people unconditionally, as we love people for who they are, not for what they can give, I think we're actually a really powerful prophetic voice of God's love to the world. Because, you know, how did Jesus say that everybody would know that we were his disciples? It wasn't by what good church meetings we put on. It wasn't by how many people got healed or raised from the dead or anything like that. It was actually how much we love one another. But as I said earlier, in order to love, we have got to know how loved we are. And I think that's where we come back to all the time, is knowing how loved we are. So if you like, there's some of the foundations of our ministry. I think they're important foundations of our ministry amongst older people. Okay, so they're the foundations. What I want to challenge us really and think about this morning is what we're building on those foundations. You know, what are the aims and the goals of our ministry amongst older people? You know, is it that our aim is that older people will feel less lonely? Is it that they would have increased sense of well-being? They're all good aims, nothing wrong with those aims if that's what we're trying to build. But I guess my challenge is, what's different to what Age UK down the road are trying to do? You know, what do we as church have to offer that's different, that's more? And I suppose for me, one of the things I think, certainly for our aim as an organisation, is that older people will know and experience God's love for themselves, and they'll experience what Jesus meant by later life in all its fullness. You know, that's what we want to build on, these foundations. You know, that older people would really know that love and experience it, and know what fullness of life is, even in those later years. So how do we go about building? If we know what we're trying to build, and perhaps we can have a discussion around this at the end if there's time, in terms of what we're trying to build, how do we go about building? We haven't really got much time to talk about it, but again, there's lots of ideas in the book that I've written, and I'm sure you're all doing amazing things anyway. Some of the key principles that I always tell people are simply this, for especially people starting out in ministry amongst older people, is look, listen and love. very simple. You know, look for the older people that you're trying to serve. Where are they? Look for those. We have to be intentional about looking, because sometimes older people are hidden, especially if they're carers or if they've got dementia or if they're in a care home and things like that. So we need to look, we need to listen. We can't assume what the needs of older people are. We can't assume that they have needs, actually, because, well, actually we can assume, because, and that might seem a bit controversial, but we all have needs. I don't know about you, but I need oxygen to breathe, you know, and to live. I need water. We all have needs. So, but it's just about listening to people to find out what their needs are and how we can best serve them. And then love. Everything we do always comes back to this, is about loving people. And I was telling a group the other day, one of the highest compliments I've ever received in ministry amongst older people was when an older gentleman in our church came up and said to me, "You really love us oldies, don't you?" And I was like, "Yeah, I really do." But it's just God's love in me flowing out to them. It's what God has put in our hearts. And if we love people, you know, love covers a multitude of things that we do wrong. We're always going to make mistakes. We're always going to do things wrong. But if people feel loved, that's really the bottom line.